Hello again. Welcome back to Background Historian. Tonight will be a special episode, as we will explore the entirety of the history of the United States of America. For the Americans watching this, enjoy listening to the tremendous story of your nation being settled, founded, and its growth to become a world superpower as you drift to sleep. For others interested in the founding and development of America, listen as you fall asleep to the story of one of the most prominent countries of our millennia. Without further ado, let's begin. Part 1. Before the beginning, the land and its first peoples. Long before the word America was ever spoken, the land stretched in silence, vast plains rolling endlessly under the sky, towering mountains cutting through the horizon, deep forests whispering in the wind, and rivers so wide and powerful they seemed to carry eternity itself in their currents. Here, countless generations of native peoples lived, thrived, and built cultures as rich and varied as the landscapes they called home. They were the first stewards of the land, shaping their lives to the rhythms of the seasons. In the East, the Iroquois Confederacy organized powerful alliances, bound not only by blood but by law and diplomacy. In the Southwest, the Pueblo peoples constructed adobe cities that glowed red beneath the desert sun, their walls echoing with the voices of storytellers and chants carried through the dry air. On the Great Plains, nations like the Lakota, Blackfoot, and Comanche lived in harmony with the herds of bison, their migrations forming the heartbeat of their lives. Along the Pacific coast, the Chinook and others crafted canoes that glided like shadows over the water, their people feasting on salmon and shellfish. Each tribe had its own beliefs, but many shared a deep respect for the natural world. They did not see the land as something to own, but as a partner, a spirit, a living force with which they existed in balance. They built not just homes and tools, but entire ways of seeing the world. The mound builders of the Mississippi River Valley raised earthworks so large they rivaled small pyramids, their ceremonial sites places of both worship and governance. Oral traditions carried their history, not written on parchment but spoken around fires, sung in rituals, and passed from elders to children. This was not an empty land awaiting discovery, it was a living, breathing civilization. And it would be here, among these people and their ancient lands, that the story of the United States would eventually take root. But change was coming. Across the Atlantic, ships were being built, sails were being raised, and eyes were turning westward. The quiet centuries of the first Americans were about to meet the restless ambitions of the Old World. Part 2. The Age of Exploration, when the Old World crossed the New. The year was 1492, and the Atlantic Ocean stretched like an endless, mysterious veil between two worlds. For centuries, Europe had dreamed of reaching distant lands, India, China, the fabled islands of gold and spice. But the men and women who first crossed westward did not know that another world already waited. When Christopher Columbus set sail under the Spanish crown, his voyage was not the first contact across the ocean. The Norse had touched Greenland and even North America centuries before. But Columbus's journey would be the spark that set the stage for centuries of transformation, conflict, and eventual nation-building. Soon after, explorers from Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands followed, each planting their flags on different stretches of coastlines, each claiming land not empty, but full of people who had lived there for millennia. Hernán Cortés in Mexico, Jacques Cartier in Canada, John Cabot along the North American coasts, all carried ambitions of wealth, power, and empire. The Spanish built missions in the south and west, their priests ringing church bells in deserts where pueblos once sang their own prayers. The French settled in the north, trading furs with native nations along the St. Lawrence and Mississippi. The Dutch carved out trading posts, including the settlement that would one day become New York City. And then came the English. At first, their colonies were fragile things. Jamestown, founded in 1607, nearly starved in its first years. Yet tobacco, worked largely through the forced labor of indentured servants and later enslaved Africans, brought survival and profit. The Pilgrims, landing on the rocky coast of New England in 1620, signed the Mayflower Compact, promising self-governance in a strange new land. Their story would later become a cornerstone of American mythology. But behind these early beginnings was a darker truth. Disease carried across the ocean swept through native communities, killing millions who had no immunity to foreign illnesses. Entire nations disappeared in a generation. Where once there had been bustling cities, vast networks of trade, and endless voices telling ancient stories, silence spread. Still, those who survived adapted. Some tribes allied with the newcomers for trade or defense. Others fought fiercely to defend their homelands. The clash of worlds had begun, and neither would ever be the same again. This was the seedbed of America, European ambition meeting native endurance, on a land rich with possibility and tragedy alike. The stage was now set for colonies to grow, for cultures to collide, and for a nation still centuries from birth to begin taking shape. Part 3: The 13 Colonies, Foundations of a New World. By the early 1600s, the English presence in North America was no longer a dream but a growing reality. Along the Atlantic seaboard, scattered settlements slowly knit themselves into communities that would one day become the foundation of the United States. The 13 colonies did not appear overnight. They were planted one by one, stretching from the rocky coasts of New England to the warm marshlands of Georgia. Each colony had its own reason for being, some born from the thirst for profit, others from the hunger for religious freedom, and still others as havens for those fleeing poverty or persecution in Europe. In the North, New England colonies like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut grew around town meetings and tight-knit villages. Their people were often Puritans, seeking to build a city upon a hill, a community that they believed would be a shining example of godly living. Life was strict and disciplined, with long sermons on Sundays and hard labor every other day. Yet these communities fostered early traditions of self-government, where free men gathered to vote on local laws. In the Middle Colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, diversity flourished. Dutch, English, Germans, Swedes, and Quakers lived side by side. The soil was rich, the rivers wide, and trade bustled through ports like New York and Philadelphia. William Penn's Pennsylvania became known as a holy experiment, promising tolerance for many faiths in an age when Europe still burned with religious wars. Farther south, colonies like Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia depended on plantations. Tobacco, rice, and indigo grew in vast fields, worked at first by indentured servants and soon by enslaved Africans whose forced labor would become the backbone of the Southern economy. The wealth of a few planters grew immense, while the suffering of the enslaved grew deeper with each passing year. But despite these differences, a common thread began to bind the colonies. The experience of building a new life far from the kings and courts of Europe. Colonists grew used to managing their own affairs, trading with neighbors, and deciding for themselves how their towns would run. Still, the hand of England was never far away. Governors were appointed in the king's name, taxes collected for the crown, and trade restricted by laws that ensured profits flowed back to London. Yet the colonies learned quickly to stretch these rules, smuggling when necessary, bending laws when possible. Independence of spirit was taking root long before independence of nation was even imagined. And through it all, native nations remained present, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, always deeply impacted by the relentless push of European settlement westward. By the mid-1700s, the 13 colonies were a patchwork of cultures, religions, and economies. But together, they were slowly shaping a uniquely American identity. One that valued self-reliance, community, and a restless sense that perhaps they could govern themselves better than a king across the sea. Part 4: The Road to Revolution, Seeds of Independence. By the mid-1700s, the 13 colonies had matured into thriving communities. Ships moved constantly through busy harbors, farmers tilled the fertile soil of the middle colonies, and southern plantations exported tobacco and rice by the ton. Life was difficult, but it was also prosperous, so long as you weren't enslaved or forced from your ancestral lands. Still, beneath this prosperity, a quiet tension grew. The colonists were loyal subjects of Britain, yet they lived a world away from the king's court. Many had never set foot on English soil. Their lives were shaped less by London and more by their own assemblies, churches, and local traditions. Then came the spark that began to change everything: the French and Indian War. Fought between 1754 and 1763, this conflict pitted Britain and its colonial subjects against France and many Native American allies. Though the colonists and Britain emerged victorious, the war left England deeply in debt. The Crown decided that the colonies should help pay the bill. New taxes followed. The Stamp Act of 1765 required colonists to pay a tax on every printed document, from newspapers to playing cards. The Townshend Acts added taxes on glass, paper, and tea. To London, these seemed reasonable; to the colonists, they felt like shackles. Taxation without representation became their rallying cry. How could they be taxed by a parliament in which they had no voice? The sense of injustice spread from taverns to churches, from city streets to rural farms. Protests turned into organized resistance. The Sons of Liberty formed in Boston, men willing to take bold, often violent action against British rule. Pamphlets were printed, speeches given, boycotts organized. Colonists refused to buy taxed goods, choosing instead to brew their own tea, spin their own cloth, and chart their own path. The tension reached a breaking point in 1770 with the Boston Massacre, when British soldiers fired into a crowd, killing 5 colonists. For many, it proved that the Crown would use force, not reason, to keep them obedient. And then came the night that echoed across history, the Boston Tea Party of 1773. Disguised as Mohawk Indians, colonists boarded British ships and dumped hundreds of chests of tea into the harbor, the dark leaves staining the cold salt water. It was a message, bold, defiant, and impossible to ignore. Britain responded with the coercive acts, known to the colonists as the Intolerable Acts, shutting down Boston's harbor and stripping Massachusetts of many rights. But rather than intimidate the colonies, these laws united them. Delegates from across the colonies gathered in Philadelphia in 1774 for the First Continental Congress. For the first time, the colonies began to see themselves not as separate outposts, but as one people with a shared destiny. The road to revolution had begun. And in the quiet towns and fields of New England, men were already oiling their muskets, sharpening their bayonets, and whispering about the day they might stand against the most powerful empire in the world. Part 5: The Revolutionary War, Birth of a Nation in Fire. The year was 1775, and the world was changing in the colonies. The quiet tension that had built for years was finally ready to erupt. The question was no longer whether the colonists would resist Britain, it was how far they would go. The first shots, Lexington and Concord. It began in Massachusetts. On the chilly morning of April 19, 1775, British soldiers marched toward the towns of Lexington and Concord, determined to seize colonial weapons stockpiled there. Waiting for them were groups of colonial militia. Ordinary farmers, tradesmen, and blacksmiths, armed with muskets and resolve. As the redcoats advanced on Lexington Green, a shot rang out. No one knows who fired it, but it would become known as the shot heard round the world. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonists lay dead. Yet the British soon found themselves harassed along the road by swarms of militia, firing from behind stone walls and trees. The Revolutionary War had begun. The rise of the Continental Army. News spread like wildfire. Across the colonies, men grabbed their muskets and answered the call. Delegates reconvened in Philadelphia, forming the Second Continental Congress, and in June 1775 they appointed a tall Virginian planter as commander-in-chief of the new Continental Army, George Washington. Washington had experience from the French and Indian War and carried himself with a quiet authority. He was not just chosen for skill, but for symbolism. A Southern leader who could unite the northern colonies with the southern ones. Meanwhile, the British fortified Boston. The colonists, in turn, entrenched themselves on the hills outside the city. On June 17, 1775, the Battle of Bunker Hill was fought. The colonists eventually retreated, but only after inflicting heavy losses on the British. It proved to both sides that the colonists could fight, and that the war would be longer and bloodier than anyone imagined. Toward independence. At first, many colonists still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. But by 1776, that hope was fading. The publication of Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, stirred the hearts of thousands. In plain language, Paine argued it was absurd for a vast continent to be governed by a small island across the sea. His words spread like fire through taverns, churches, and marketplaces. The momentum became unstoppable. On July 4, 1776, after heated debate, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, penned largely by Thomas Jefferson. Its words were radical, declaring that all men are created equal, and that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. For colonists, it was a call to freedom. For Britain, it was treason. A war of hardship. The years that followed tested the new nation. Washington's army was poorly supplied, often barefoot in the snow, short of food, ammunition, and clothing. Many soldiers deserted, and others died from disease and exposure. Yet the spirit of liberty carried them on. The crossing of the Delaware in December 1776 marked one of Washington's boldest moves, as he led his men across icy waters on Christmas night to surprise Hessian forces in Trenton, New Jersey. The victory reinvigorated the cause. By 1777, the war grew into a global conflict. The colonists' victory at Saratoga convinced France to formally join their side, bringing ships, troops, and much-needed supplies. The American Revolution was no longer a rebellion, it had become a war of nations. The winter at Valley Forge. The harsh winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge tested the Army's endurance. Washington's men starved, shivered, and suffered, but under the training of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer, they emerged stronger and more disciplined. Out of suffering, the Continental Army became a professional fighting force. Toward victory. The war raged on for years, with battles from the north to the Carolinas. In 1781, fortune finally turned in the Americans' favor at Yorktown, Virginia. With French ships cutting off British reinforcements by sea and American and French troops surrounding by land, General Cornwallis surrendered. The world shifted in that moment. A nation is born. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris officially ended the war. Britain recognized the independence of the United States of America, a nation born not of ancient kings but of farmers, tradesmen, philosophers, and rebels who believed in the radical idea of liberty. Yet the victory was only the beginning. The war had freed them from Britain, but it had not yet told them how they would govern themselves, how they would heal, or what it would mean to truly be American. The flames of revolution had forged the United States. Now, they had to learn how to live as one. Part 6, Building the Republic, the Constitution and the Birth of Government. The guns of the Revolutionary War had fallen silent. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. Independence had been won, but in many ways, the harder task now lay ahead. For the first time, 13 colonies, now free states, had to decide how to govern themselves without a king. The fragile first steps, the Articles of Confederation. The first attempt at unity was the Articles of Confederation, a document that loosely bound the states together. It gave Congress the power to make laws and declare war, but it left most real authority in the hands of the individual states. At first, it seemed practical. Each state cherished its independence, wary of any central authority that might resemble the monarchy they had just thrown off. But the weaknesses of the Articles quickly showed. Congress had no power to tax, no authority to regulate trade, and no way to enforce its decisions. Soldiers went unpaid, debts mounted, and rivalries between states flared. The young nation was free, but fragile. The call for change. By the mid-1780s, many leaders realized that without stronger unity, the United States might collapse before it truly began. Farmers in Massachusetts, driven by debt and high taxes, rose in open rebellion in Shays' Rebellion. The uprising shocked the country and made clear that the Articles of Confederation were too weak to hold the Union together. So, in 1787, delegates from 12 of the 13 states gathered in Philadelphia. What was meant to be a meeting to revise the Articles quickly became something far greater. The Constitutional Convention. Inside the hot, stuffy hall, debates raged for months. The men gathered there, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and others, were determined to craft a new framework of government. They argued over big states versus small states, over representation, over slavery, and over the balance between federal and state power. At last, compromises were struck. A bicameral Congress with a House of Representatives, based on population, and a Senate, 2 senators per state. A strong executive branch, led by a president. A system of checks and balances, ensuring no branch could grow too powerful. The ability to amend the Constitution so it could adapt as the nation grew. And though the Constitution was silent on many of the great contradictions, especially slavery, it became the framework upon which the United States was built. Ratification and the Bill of Rights. The Constitution was signed in September 1787, but it was not yet law. It had to be ratified by the states. Fierce debates broke out. The Federalists, led by men like Hamilton and Madison, argued that a strong central government was necessary. The Anti-Federalists feared it would trample individual liberties. To ease those fears, a promise was made: a Bill of Rights would be added, guaranteeing freedoms like speech, press, religion, and the right to a fair trial. By 1791, the first 10 amendments were adopted, becoming the foundation of American liberty. Washington takes the helm. In 1789, the people turned to the one man they trusted above all to lead this new republic, George Washington. Reluctant at first, Washington accepted the presidency, setting precedents that would guide the office for centuries. He served with dignity and restraint, proving that the United States could have powerful leadership without sliding into tyranny. The government was young, the Constitution still untested, and the people still finding their place in this grand experiment. But a foundation had been laid, a structure strong enough to endure challenges, yet flexible enough to grow. The United States of America was not just a dream now. It was a functioning nation. Part 7. The Early Republic, Growth, Conflict, and the First Presidents. The ink on the Constitution was barely dry when the United States entered its earliest, most fragile years. The young republic was an experiment in governance the world had never seen before. And like any experiment, it faced doubt, conflict, and the challenge of proving itself. Washington's steady hand. In 1789, George Washington became the nation's first president. He was not a king, nor did he wish to be. Instead, he approached the presidency with humility, aware that his actions would set precedents for generations to come. Washington formed the first cabinet, choosing trusted leaders. Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State. Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. Henry Knox as Secretary of War. It was Hamilton and Jefferson who quickly became the embodiment of America's first great political divide. The birth of political parties. Hamilton believed in a strong central government, a national bank, and a focus on industry and commerce. Jefferson envisioned a nation of independent farmers, wary of central power and deeply rooted in states' rights. Their rivalry gave birth to America's first political parties, the Federalists, aligned with Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson. Though Washington himself warned against political factions in his farewell address, the seeds of partisanship had been planted. Challenges abroad and at home. The young nation could not remain isolated from the world. Britain and France were once again at war, and both pressured the U.S. to take sides. Washington chose neutrality, a decision unpopular with many but vital for preserving America's fragile stability. At home, domestic challenges arose. Farmers in western Pennsylvania revolted against a federal tax on whiskey, sparking the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. Washington personally led troops to put down the uprising, an act that demonstrated the federal government's newfound authority. John Adams and growing pains. In 1796, John Adams became the second president. His term was fraught with difficulty. Relations with France soured, leading to the Quasi-War, an undeclared naval conflict. At home, the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts restricted speech critical of the government, causing outrage among Jefferson's supporters. Adams was a man of principle, but his presidency deepened political divides. The Jefferson Era and a Growing Nation. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson was elected, marking the first peaceful transfer of power between political rivals, a revolutionary moment in its own right. Jefferson's presidency brought dramatic changes. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, which doubled the nation's size and opened vast western lands for settlement. The Lewis and Clark Expedition, which charted rivers, mountains, and tribes, igniting dreams of westward expansion. Efforts to reduce the size of government and promote agrarian ideals. Yet challenges remained. Conflicts with native tribes escalated as settlers pushed west. Britain continued to harass American ships on the seas. The path forward was full of promise, but also peril. A nation in transition. By the early 1800s, the United States had grown from a fragile collection of states into a nation stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. Its leaders were learning to balance liberty with authority, ambition with restraint. But as the country expanded, so too did the tensions that would one day threaten to tear it apart, questions of slavery, states' rights, and the meaning of liberty itself. For now, though, the young republic pressed forward, confident in its promise and determined to prove that freedom could endure. Part 8, The War of 1812, America's Second Struggle for Independence. By the second decade of the 1800s, the United States had grown stronger, yet its independence was still being tested. Britain, still locked in conflict with Napoleon's France, treated America less like a sovereign nation and more like a nuisance standing in the way of empire. The result would be a war many Americans came to call their second fight for independence, the War of 1812. Causes of the war. The roots of the conflict ran deep. Impressment of sailors, the British Navy, desperate for manpower, captured American sailors and forced them into service. Trade restrictions, Britain sought to choke America's trade with France, crippling American merchants. Native resistance, on the frontier, many native tribes, led by figures like Tecumseh, resisted American expansion, supported in part by British arms and supplies. Pride also played its part. A young nation could not allow itself to be treated as weak without risking its very identity. The early struggles. In June 1812, President James Madison asked Congress to declare war. Yet the United States was not fully prepared. Its army was small, its navy tiny compared to Britain's mighty fleet. Early attempts to invade Canada failed disastrously, and American troops often found themselves retreating under fire. Still, there were bright spots. The U.S. Navy, though small, proved fierce. Ships like the USS Constitution, nicknamed Old Ironsides, won stunning victories over British vessels, their cannonballs bouncing harmlessly off its strong oak hull. These triumphs lifted American morale and gave birth to naval legends. The burning of Washington. In 1814, British forces struck a humiliating blow. They marched into Washington, D.C., and set fire to the Capitol, the Treasury, and the White House itself. President Madison and his wife Dolly fled, with Dolly famously saving a portrait of George Washington before escaping. The flames lit the night sky, a stark reminder of how vulnerable the young nation remained. The Battle of Baltimore and the Star-Spangled Banner. Yet from the ashes came resilience. That same year, the British turned their sights on Baltimore. For 25 hours, they bombarded Fort McHenry with rockets and shells. When dawn broke, the American flag still waved defiantly above the fort. Watching from a British ship, a lawyer named Francis Scott Key was so moved by the sight that he wrote a poem, words that would one day become the Star-Spangled Banner, the national anthem. The Hero of New Orleans. In January 1815, long after peace negotiations had already begun, the Americans won a stunning victory at the Battle of New Orleans. General Andrew Jackson, leading a ragtag army of militia, frontiersmen, free African Americans, and even pirates, crushed the British assault. The victory electrified the nation and made Jackson a hero, though the war itself had technically already ended. The Treaty of Ghent. The war officially ended with the Treaty of Ghent in December 1814. Neither side gained or lost territory, but for Americans, it was a triumph. They had stood up to the world's greatest empire, again, and survived. National pride surged, ushering in what would be called the era of good feelings. A nation more confident. The War of 1812 did not redraw maps or topple empires, but it gave the United States something more important, a sense of unity and confidence. The Republic had proven it could endure storms from without and still stand tall. The young nation was ready to look inward now, to grow, expand, and wrestle with its own destiny on the vast continent that stretched before it. Part 9. Westward Expansion, the Frontier and Manifest Destiny. In the years after the War of 1812, America turned its eyes not across the ocean, but across its own vast land. The Republic was young, ambitious, and restless. The frontier. Rolling plains, towering mountains, and forests stretching beyond imagination, called out to settlers, promising opportunity and adventure. The pull of the West. For farmers, land meant independence. For traders, it meant wealth. For families, it meant a fresh start. And for the United States as a whole, it meant power. Slowly, the frontier line crept westward, and with it came both promise and peril. By the 1820s and 1830s, waves of settlers pushed beyond the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio Valley, the Mississippi River Basin, and beyond. The expansion was fueled by a powerful belief that would come to define the 19th century, manifest destiny, the conviction that the United States was destined to expand across the continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Native displacement. But this expansion came at a terrible cost. Native American nations, who had lived on these lands for centuries, were systematically pushed aside. Treaties were signed, then broken. Lands were ceded, often under pressure or threat. One of the darkest chapters was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, championed by President Andrew Jackson. It forced thousands of native people, Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, to leave their ancestral lands and move west of the Mississippi. The most infamous journey became known as the Trail of Tears. In the bitter cold of the 1830s, men, women, and children were marched hundreds of miles. Thousands died from hunger, exposure, and disease. The frontier may have been a place of hope for settlers, but for native peoples, it was a place of sorrow. Trails and settlers. Meanwhile, settlers carved paths into the wilderness. The Oregon Trail became a lifeline for families seeking fertile farmland in the Pacific Northwest. Wagon trains creaked across endless plains, fording rivers, facing storms, and burying loved ones by the roadside. The lure of California's gold in 1849 brought a rush of fortune seekers. The promise of quick riches pulled people west in droves, swelling towns overnight and leaving behind ghost towns when the dreams of gold ran dry. Texas and the Mexican-American War. Westward expansion also brought conflict with other nations. In the 1830s, American settlers in Texas, then part of Mexico, fought for independence. Figures like Davy Crockett and Sam Houston became legends in the Battle of the Alamo and the eventual victory at San Jacinto. By 1845, Texas joined the United States, and tensions with Mexico exploded into the Mexican-American War. U.S. forces marched into Mexico City, and in 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo handed America vast new territories: California, New Mexico, Arizona, and more. The dream of a coast-to-coast nation was nearly complete. The railroad and the iron horse. The mid-1800s brought the railroad, which transformed expansion. Where wagons had once taken months, trains could carry settlers, goods, and mail in weeks. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, bound the nation together like never before, uniting east and west across plains and mountains. A nation of contradictions. But the frontier was not just adventure and growth. It was also tension. Every new territory raised the same burning question: would slavery spread there, or would it be free? The more America grew, the more it became clear, expansion was not just about land. It was about identity, morality, and the very definition of freedom. The land of promise was also becoming a land of division. And the storm of civil war was beginning to gather on the horizon. Part 10: A Nation Divided, The Road to the Civil War. By the mid-1800s, the United States stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, a nation vast and full of promise. But beneath its growth lay a fracture so deep that it threatened to tear the Republic apart. That fracture was slavery. The growing divide. In the North, industry was rising. Cities bustled with factories, railroads, and immigrants arriving from Europe. Many Northerners saw slavery as morally wrong and economically outdated. In the South, the economy depended heavily on slave labor. Cotton was king, and enslaved African Americans worked vast plantations under brutal conditions. For wealthy planters, slavery was not just an institution but a way of life and a foundation of wealth. As new states and territories were added, the great question became unavoidable: would slavery expand into them, or would they remain free? Attempts at compromise. The government tried again and again to find balance. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, drawing an imaginary line across the nation to separate future free and slave territories. The Compromise of 1850 attempted to settle disputes by admitting California as a free state while passing the Fugitive Slave Act, which required escaped enslaved people to be returned even from free states. But each compromise was temporary, a bandage over a deepening wound. Voices rising. The 1830s and 1840s saw the rise of the abolitionist movement. Leaders like Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave turned powerful orator, and Harriet Tubman, who guided enslaved people to freedom on the Underground Railroad, gave voice and action to the fight against slavery. Literature fueled the cause. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that revealed the cruelty of slavery to millions of readers. Abraham Lincoln himself later called Stowe the little lady who made this big war. Bleeding Kansas. In the 1850s, the conflict turned violent. The Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed settlers to decide for themselves whether their territories would allow slavery. The result was chaos. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, and brutal fighting broke out. The territory became known as Bleeding Kansas. The Dred Scott Decision. Then, in 1857, the Supreme Court delivered a ruling that shook the nation. In the Dred Scott case, the court declared that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, were not citizens and had no rights under the Constitution. The decision outraged the North and emboldened the South, widening the rift even further. The rise of Lincoln. In 1860, a tall, self-taught lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Lincoln opposed the spread of slavery, though he did not initially call for its immediate abolition. For many in the South, his election was proof that their way of life was under threat. Within months, Southern states began to secede from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. The fragile balance had broken. The storm that had been building for decades was finally here. The Civil War was about to begin. Part 11: The Civil War, a Nation at War with Itself. The year was 1861. The air was thick with tension, and the United States, not yet a century old, stood on the brink of destruction. When Southern states seceded to form the Confederate States of America, the Union could no longer hold. The Civil War had begun, 4 years of fire, blood, and sacrifice that would determine the very meaning of freedom. The war begins. The first shots rang out at Fort Sumter, a Union stronghold in South Carolina, on April 12, 1861. Cannon fire echoed across Charleston Harbor, and within hours, the Civil War was underway. Both sides believed it might be a short conflict. Neither could imagine the scale of suffering to come. The Union and the Confederacy. The Union, led by President Abraham Lincoln, fought not only to preserve the United States but, increasingly, to end slavery. It held the advantage of larger population, more factories, and a stronger navy. The Confederacy, led by President Jefferson Davis, fought for independence and the preservation of a slave-based way of life. Though smaller in numbers, it was fueled by determination and led by brilliant generals such as Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. Early struggles. At first, the South gained momentum. Victories at battles like Bull Run shocked the North, proving this would be no easy fight. Confederate soldiers, though less equipped, fought with fierce resolve. Lincoln struggled to find effective generals. Many early Union leaders moved too cautiously, failing to deliver decisive blows. The human cost. The war was not fought only by soldiers but endured by families. Fields became battlefields, towns turned to ruins. The invention of the rifled musket made combat deadlier than ever, while disease claimed more lives than bullets. Nearly every family, North and South, felt the weight of loss. The turning point. By 1863, the war reached its height. On January 1, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in Confederate territory free. Though it did not immediately end slavery, it transformed the war into a battle not just for Union, but for freedom. That same year, the Union claimed 2 crucial victories. Gettysburg, a 3-day battle in Pennsylvania, where Union forces turned back Lee's invasion of the North. Vicksburg, where Union forces gained control of the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in 2. These victories marked the turning tide. Lincoln's words. At Gettysburg, Lincoln gave a speech of only a few minutes, yet it became immortal. The Gettysburg Address. In it, he spoke of a new birth of freedom and a government of the people, by the people, for the people. His words reminded a grieving nation why it must endure. The end approaches. By 1864, Union General Ulysses S. Grant pressed relentlessly in the East, while General William Tecumseh Sherman marched through Georgia, leaving a trail of destruction to break the South's will. Finally, in April 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The long, bitter war was over. The price of Union. The Civil War claimed more than 600,000 lives, more than any other conflict in American history. Cities burned, families shattered, and wounds ran deep. But the Union had been preserved, and slavery had been dealt a mortal blow. Lincoln, however, would not live to see the full fruits of victory. Just days after the surrender, he was assassinated at Ford's Theater. The nation that had endured so much now wept for the men who had guided it through its darkest hours. The war was over, but the struggle to rebuild a fractured nation had only just begun. Part 12, Reconstruction, Rebuilding a Broken Nation. The Civil War had ended, but the battle to define the United States was far from over. The Union had been preserved. Slavery had been abolished. But the cost had been unimaginable. The South lay in ruins, its economy shattered, its cities burned, and its people exhausted. The North, though victorious, mourned hundreds of thousands of dead. And the question loomed like a storm cloud over the nation: how do you rebuild a country that just fought itself to the brink of destruction? The assassination of Lincoln. On April 14, 1865, Just days after General Lee's surrender at Appomattox, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer, while attending a play in Washington, D.C. The nation plunged into mourning. Lincoln's death left a vacuum of leadership at a critical moment. The task of Reconstruction now fell to his vice president, Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat with very different views on how to reunite the nation. The 13th Amendment. Before Lincoln's death, Congress had passed the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery in the United States once and for all. It was ratified in December 1865. 4 million enslaved African Americans were now legally free, but legal freedom did not guarantee equality, opportunity, or safety. Presidential versus congressional Reconstruction. President Johnson pushed for a swift and lenient reunification. He offered pardons to former Confederates and allowed Southern states to form new governments with minimal federal oversight. But many in Congress, particularly the radical Republicans, believed this approach betrayed the sacrifices of the war. They wanted to guarantee civil rights for freed African Americans and prevent the former Confederate elite from regaining power. A struggle ensued. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which granted citizenship to formerly enslaved people. When Johnson vetoed it, Congress overrode him, a rare and powerful move. This led to the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed equal protection under the law to all citizens. Reconstruction Acts and Federal Intervention. In 1867, Congress imposed military reconstruction, dividing the South into 5 military districts and requiring states to ratify the 14th Amendment and create new state constitutions guaranteeing black suffrage. Federal troops were stationed throughout the South to enforce these changes. For the first time, African American men voted, ran for office, and even served in state legislatures and the U.S. Congress. It was a moment of radical possibility. Backlash and resistance. But the backlash was swift and brutal. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan formed, using violence and terror to intimidate black voters and leaders. Lynching, arson, and intimidation became common tools of political control. Southern states passed black codes, laws that restricted the movement, labor, and rights of freed people. Though struck down at the federal level, their legacy would morph into Jim Crow laws in decades to come. The 15th Amendment and the Limits of Progress. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified, guaranteeing the right to vote regardless of race. It was a milestone, but not an end. As Northern support for Reconstruction waned and economic concerns took center stage, federal troops were slowly withdrawn. The final blow came in 1877 with the Compromise of 1877, which ended Reconstruction in exchange for resolving a contested presidential election. The South was left to govern itself. The fragile gains of Reconstruction began to crumble. A shattered promise. Though slavery had ended, a new system of racial oppression took its place: sharecropping, segregation, and systemic disenfranchisement. Freed people were no longer property, but many were still treated as less than equal citizens. Yet the legacy of Reconstruction endures. The amendments passed, especially the 14th and 15th, would become the legal foundation for future civil rights struggles. And the brave men and women who demanded justice in the face of violence left behind a blueprint for resistance. Reconstruction was a chapter of hope, betrayal, and the unfinished work of freedom. America had survived civil war, but the question of racial equality, of who truly belonged to the promise of liberty, remained unanswered. Part 13: The Gilded Age, Industry, Immigration, and Inequality. The Civil War and Reconstruction had left America scarred, but the closing decades of the 19th century brought a new kind of transformation. One of steel, smoke, and staggering change. Historians call this period the Gilded Age, a time when America glittered with progress on the surface, but underneath, deep struggles and inequality simmered. Industry and the rise of giants. The United States was becoming an industrial powerhouse. Railroads stretched across the continent, linking towns and cities in a way never before possible. Steel mills, textile factories, and oil refineries hummed with activity. Powerful industrialists rose to dominate entire industries. Andrew Carnegie in steel. John D. Rockefeller in oil. Cornelius Vanderbilt in railroads. J.P. Morgan in banking. They were celebrated as captains of industry by some, and condemned as robber barons by others. Their wealth was immense, their influence on politics undeniable, and their names became synonymous with both progress and greed. Immigration and the melting pot. At the same time, waves of immigrants poured into America. From 1870 to 1900, millions arrived, fleeing famine, poverty, or political unrest in places like Ireland, Germany, Italy, and Eastern Europe. They crowded into cities, finding work in factories, building railroads, and settling in ethnic neighborhoods where familiar languages and traditions offered comfort. In New York Harbor, the Statue of Liberty, dedicated in 1886, became a beacon of hope, welcoming the tired, the poor, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. But life was not easy. Many immigrants lived in cramped tenements, working long hours for little pay. Prejudice and discrimination often met them at every turn, yet their labor and determination fueled the nation's growth. Urbanization and innovation. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh grew rapidly, their skylines rising with steel frame buildings and electric lights. Inventions transformed daily life. The telephone, patented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876. The light bulb, perfected by Thomas Edison in 1879. Advances in farming equipment, which changed agriculture forever. America was becoming modern. But modernity had its costs. Inequality and labor struggles. While the wealthy elite lived in lavish mansions, workers struggled in dangerous conditions. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, were common in factories and mines. Child labor was widespread. Labor unions began to rise, fighting for fair wages, safer conditions, and shorter hours. Strikes erupted across the country, from the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 to the Haymarket Affair of 1886, where a labor protest in Chicago turned violent. The struggle between labor and capital became one of the defining battles of the Gilded Age. The plight of farmers. Not only factory workers suffered. Farmers, facing falling crop prices and crushing debts, organized movements like the Grange and later the Populist Party to demand reforms, including railroad regulation and monetary changes. The shadow of segregation. Meanwhile, in the South, Reconstruction had ended, and the rise of Jim Crow laws enforced racial segregation. The Supreme Court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, declared separate but equal, constitutional, cementing systemic racism that would last for generations. African Americans faced disenfranchisement, violence, and economic oppression. Yet leaders like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois began to emerge, charting different visions for progress and equality. A Gilded Promise. The Gilded Age was a time of contradictions. Wealth like the world had never seen sat beside grinding poverty. Innovation lit up the night, while exploitation darkened daily life. America was rising, yes, but beneath the gold veneer, the cracks of inequality were widening. And as the century turned, a new force was brewing, reformers ready to confront corruption, inequality, and injustice. Part 14, The Progressive Era, Reform and the Fight for Justice. By the dawn of the 20th century, the United States stood tall as an industrial giant. The railroads stretched from coast to coast, factories roared with machines, and skyscrapers pierced the skies of cities like New York and Chicago. But with progress came peril. Poverty, corruption, unsafe working conditions, and social inequality cried out for change. This period, roughly from the 1890s to the 1920s, became known as the Progressive Era, a time when reformers sought to reshape America into a more just, fair, and humane society. The Voices of Reform. Progressives were not a single group but a diverse coalition: journalists, teachers, politicians, and everyday citizens. They believed government should step in to solve problems created by rapid industrialization and urbanization. Journalists known as muckrakers exposed the nation's darkest corners. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle revealed the horrific conditions in the meatpacking industry, leading to food safety laws. Ida Tarbell wrote about the ruthless practices of John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. Jacob Riis, with his photographs in How the Other Half Lives, showed the harsh realities of life in city tenements. Their words and images shocked the public, sparking demands for reform. Political reform and the people's voice. At the local and state levels, reformers pushed for laws to give more power to ordinary citizens. The initiative, allowing citizens to propose laws. The referendum, giving them the chance to vote directly on legislation. The recall, enabling them to remove corrupt officials. The 17th Amendment, 1913, established the direct election of U.S. senators, reducing the grip of political machines and wealthy elites. Workers and labor rights. The plight of workers became a central focus. Child labor, unsafe factories, and long hours demanded action. Labor unions grew, strikes erupted, and progressives pushed for protective laws. In 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City killed 146 workers, mostly young immigrant women, when they were trapped inside a burning garment factory. The tragedy shocked the nation and led to sweeping workplace safety regulations. Women rise to the challenge. Women played a powerful role in the progressive era. Leaders like Jane Addams, who founded Hull House in Chicago, worked to provide education, childcare, and support for immigrants. And the long struggle for women's suffrage reached its climax. After decades of organizing, marching, and protesting, the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, finally granting American women the right to vote. It was a triumph born from persistence and courage. Fighting for racial justice. African Americans faced the harsh realities of Jim Crow laws and systemic racism. Booker T. Washington advocated for vocational training and self-reliance, while W.E.B. Du Bois demanded full civil rights and helped found the NAACP in 1909, which became a powerful voice for racial justice. Presidential progressivism. Presidents of the era took up the cause as well. Theodore Roosevelt, a dynamic leader, broke up monopolies, championed conservation, and pushed for consumer protections. William Howard Taft continued trust-busting but leaned more conservatively. Woodrow Wilson passed reforms on banking, tariffs, and workers' rights, though his record on race was deeply flawed. Conservation and the natural world. For the first time, America began to see its natural landscapes as treasures to protect. Roosevelt, a passionate outdoorsman, helped establish national parks, forests, and wildlife refuges. The idea of preserving nature for future generations took root. A time of hope and struggle. The progressive era did not solve every problem. Inequality remained, racism persisted, and not all reforms succeeded. Yet it reshaped the American spirit, proving that citizens could demand and achieve real change. The Gilded Age had been about wealth and expansion. The progressive era was about reform and responsibility. But just as these victories were being won, a storm far greater than reformers could imagine was gathering across the Atlantic. Part 15, World War I, America enters the global stage. The progressive era had reshaped America at home, but soon, events far across the Atlantic would draw the United States into a conflict unlike any it had ever faced before. The First World War, which began in 1914, was a storm of fire and steel that engulfed Europe. At first, America watched from afar. But by 1917, the United States would be pulled into the fight, and onto the global stage. The War in Europe. The spark came in June 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated. A web of alliances turned the event into a global catastrophe. The Allied powers, including Britain, France, and Russia, faced off against the Central Powers, led by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Trench warfare defined the Western Front. Soldiers lived and died in muddy ditches, machine guns and poison gas transforming battle into slaughter. America's neutrality. When war broke out, President Woodrow Wilson declared that the United States would remain neutral. The nation was deeply divided. Immigrants often sympathized with their homelands, while many Americans wanted no part in Europe's bloodshed. But neutrality grew harder to maintain. German submarines, known as U-boats, began sinking ships carrying American passengers and goods. In 1915, the Lusitania, a British passenger liner, was torpedoed, killing 128 Americans. Outrage swept the country, though Wilson still held back from war. Then came the Zimmermann Telegram in 1917, in which Germany urged Mexico to join the war against the United States, promising to help them reclaim lost territory. When the telegram became public, American anger boiled over. The decision for war. On April 2, 1917, Wilson addressed Congress, declaring that the world must be made safe for democracy. Days later, the United States formally entered the war on the side of the Allies. Mobilizing the nation. The U.S. faced the massive task of raising an army and supplying a distant war. The Selective Service Act drafted millions of young men, while factories shifted to produce weapons, uniforms, and food for the front. For the first time, women served in significant numbers as nurses and in support roles. African Americans enlisted as well, though many were segregated into separate units and denied equal treatment. On the battlefield. By 1918, over 2 million American soldiers, known as doughboys, had crossed the Atlantic. Their arrival tipped the balance. Fresh, determined, and well supplied, they joined exhausted Allied troops in halting Germany's final offensives. At battles like Cantigny, Belleau Wood, and the Meuse-Argonne offensive, Americans proved themselves in fierce combat. Belleau Wood, in particular, cemented the reputation of the U.S. Marines, who earned the nickname Devil Dogs from German soldiers. The war ends. On November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. The armistice was signed, ending a war that had claimed over 16 million lives worldwide. At home and abroad. The war transformed America. At home, women's contributions bolstered the fight for suffrage, leading to the 19th Amendment in 1920. African Americans, many of whom had served, returned to demand greater rights, planting seeds for the civil rights movement. But the peace was uneasy. Wilson pushed for a League of Nations to prevent future wars, but the U.S. Senate refused to join, wary of being entangled in foreign conflicts again. The United States had emerged as a global power, but one unsure of how deeply it wished to engage in the affairs of the world. For now, Americans looked inward again. They wanted peace, prosperity, and a return to normalcy. But the 1920s, while glittering with jazz and invention, carried undercurrents that would shape the decades to come. Part 16, The Roaring Twenties, Prosperity and Prohibition. The guns of the Great War had fallen silent, and Americans longed to leave behind the horrors of battle. The 1920s would become a decade of dazzling change, prosperity, and cultural revolution, an age remembered as the Roaring Twenties. But beneath the glitz, there were shadows that would one day return to haunt the nation. A boom in prosperity. The end of World War I brought a surge in industry. Factories that had churned out weapons now produced cars, radios, and household goods. The rise of mass production, pioneered by Henry Ford and his assembly line for the Model T, made automobiles affordable for ordinary families. Cities swelled with skyscrapers and neon lights. Credit and installment plans allowed Americans to buy more than ever before. Stock markets soared, and speculation ran wild. For many, it seemed the good times would never end. The Jazz Age. If the economy was booming, so too was the culture. This was the age of jazz, a musical revolution born from African American communities and carried into dance halls and speakeasies across the nation. Musicians like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington filled the night with rhythm, and Harlem in New York City became the beating heart of a cultural renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance brought forth poets like Langston Hughes and writers like Zora Neale Hurston, celebrating black voices and reshaping American art and identity. Women and the Flapper Era. For women, the 1920s marked a new kind of freedom. The 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, had granted women the right to vote. Fashion, too, reflected the change. Young women known as flappers cut their hair short, wore daring dresses, and danced in ways their mothers never dared. They embraced independence, challenging the traditional roles expected of women. Prohibition and the speakeasy culture. Yet even as freedom flourished, restrictions grew. In 1920, the 18th Amendment took effect, banning the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol. What was meant as a moral reform instead gave rise to speakeasies, hidden bars where jazz thrived, and to organized crime. Figures like Al Capone in Chicago built empires on bootleg liquor, fueling a shadow economy of smuggling and bribery. Immigration and fear. The decade also revealed deep divisions. Millions of immigrants arrived, yet rising nativism led to strict quotas, restricting arrivals from Southern and Eastern Europe while virtually banning immigration from Asia. Meanwhile, the Ku Klux Klan resurged, not only targeting African Americans but also immigrants, Catholics, and Jews, spreading fear and violence across the country. Science, faith, and modernity. The Roaring Twenties also saw fierce debates over culture and belief. The Scopes trial of 1925 put science and religion on national display, as teacher John Scopes was tried for teaching evolution in Tennessee. The trial symbolized a nation grappling with modern ideas versus traditional values. The cracks beneath the glitter. While the decade glittered with jazz, cars, and wealth, the prosperity was uneven. Farmers struggled with falling crop prices. Many workers lived on the edge of poverty. And the stock market, though rising fast, was built on shaky speculation. As the 1920s roared forward, few could see the storm on the horizon. But by the decade's end, the illusion of endless prosperity would shatter, plunging the nation into its darkest economic crisis. Part 17. The Great Depression, Hardship and Hope. The Roaring Twenties had dazzled with jazz, skyscrapers, and prosperity. But when the 1930s dawned, America awoke to a nightmare. The glittering illusion of endless wealth collapsed in an instant, plunging the nation into the Great Depression, the darkest economic crisis in its history. The crash of 1929. On October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed. Millions of investors saw their savings vanish in a single day. Banks collapsed under the weight of withdrawals, and ordinary Americans lost not only their investments but their life savings. The ripple spread quickly. Factories shut down. Farmers went bankrupt. Breadlines stretched through city streets as hunger grew. The dream of prosperity had turned into a daily struggle for survival. A nation in crisis. By 1933, nearly 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed. Families lost their homes, forced to live in makeshift shantytowns known as Hoovervilles, named bitterly after President Herbert Hoover, whose response was seen as too little, too late. In the Dust Bowl states of the Midwest, a drought compounded the misery. Winds stripped away the topsoil, turning once fertile fields into barren dust storms that swallowed entire towns. Families, desperate and broken, packed what little they had and traveled west in search of work, immortalized in John Steinbeck's novel The Grapes of Wrath. The human spirit. Yet even in the bleakest years, communities found ways to endure. Families shared what little food they had. Churches and charities opened soup kitchens. Radio programs provided a bit of laughter and escape. The resilience of ordinary Americans became one of the era's most remarkable legacies. The New Deal. In 1932, Americans turned to a new leader, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. With his warm voice and message of hope, Roosevelt promised a New Deal for the American people. Through sweeping programs, the New Deal sought to stabilize the economy, provide jobs, and restore faith in the nation's future. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, put young men to work building parks, planting trees, and conserving the land. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, hired millions to build roads, schools, and bridges, while also funding artists, writers, and musicians. The Social Security Act of 1935 established a safety net for the elderly, unemployed, and disabled. New banking regulations restored confidence in the financial system. Roosevelt's fireside chats, radio broadcasts directly to the people, reassured Americans that they were not alone in their struggle. Opposition and legacy. Not everyone supported the New Deal. Some argued it gave the government too much power, while others said it didn't go far enough. But for millions of struggling families, it provided hope and survival. Looking ahead. The Great Depression reshaped America. It redefined the relationship between citizens and their government, embedding the idea that Washington had a responsibility to ensure a basic level of security and opportunity. Yet as the 1930s ended, another shadow loomed. Across the oceans, dictators were rising, and the drums of war were beating once more. For the United States, the struggle at home would soon give way to a fight for freedom abroad. Part 18, World War II, The Arsenal of Democracy. The Great Depression had left scars on America's spirit, but as the 1940s dawned, a greater storm brewed overseas. In Europe, Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany rose to power, promising conquest and domination. In Asia, Imperial Japan expanded aggressively across China and the Pacific. The world was once again on the brink of a devastating conflict. For the United States, the coming of World War II would test its strength, its unity, and its very identity. The world at war. The war began in 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, dragging Britain and France into the fight. Over the next 2 years, Nazi forces swept across Europe, while Japan pushed deeper into Asia. The United States, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, declared neutrality but could not remain untouched. FDR called America the arsenal of democracy, sending aid to Britain and other allies through programs like Lend-Lease, which provided weapons, ships, and supplies. Still, most Americans hoped to avoid direct involvement in the war. Pearl Harbor. That changed on December 7, 1941. Japanese planes roared over Hawaii, attacking the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. Battleships burned, aircraft were destroyed, and more than 2,400 Americans lost their lives. The next day, Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December 7 a date which will live in infamy. The United States declared war on Japan. Days later, Germany and Italy declared war on America. The nation was fully thrust into the global conflict. Mobilizing the nation. The response was swift and overwhelming. Millions of men enlisted or were drafted into the armed forces. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter, who became the face of women working in factories. The economy roared to life as factories produced tanks, planes, and ammunition. Rationing and war bonds became part of daily life, as every American contributed to the war effort. The fight in Europe. American troops landed first in North Africa in 1942, pushing back German forces. In 1944, the Allies launched D-Day, the massive invasion of Nazi-occupied France. On June 6, tens of thousands of American, British, and Canadian soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, facing heavy fire but securing a foothold that would lead to the liberation of Western Europe. By May 1945, Germany was in ruins. Adolf Hitler was dead, and Nazi Germany surrendered. Victory in Europe, VE Day, was celebrated with joy, though the war was not yet over. The War in the Pacific. Meanwhile, the war against Japan raged across the Pacific Ocean. Battles at places like Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa tested American forces. The fighting was brutal, often hand-to-hand, with casualties mounting on both sides. In August 1945, President Harry S. Truman, who had taken office after Roosevelt's death, made a decision that would change history. To end the war swiftly and avoid an invasion of Japan, the United States dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The devastation was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Days later, Japan surrendered. The cost of victory. World War II claimed more than 400,000 American lives and tens of millions worldwide. Yet it left the United States standing as one of the most powerful nations on Earth. The war had transformed America. Women and minorities had taken on new roles, sparking future movements for equality. The economy had boomed, ending the Great Depression. The U.S. emerged as a leader in shaping the post-war world, founding the United Nations and taking on global responsibilities. But victory brought new challenges. Across Europe, the Soviet Union's influence spread, and a new conflict was beginning, one not fought with bullets alone, but with ideology, espionage, and the threat of nuclear war. The Cold War had begun. Part 19: The Cold War Era, Rivalry, Reform, and Revolution. The guns of World War II had barely cooled when a new kind of conflict emerged, one not fought on battlefields alone, but in the halls of diplomacy, the laboratories of science, and the very hearts of nations. This was the Cold War, a decades-long rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, shaping nearly every aspect of American life from the late 1940s to the early 1990s. A world divided. After the war, Europe lay in ruins. The United States and the Soviet Union, once uneasy allies, emerged as superpowers. But their visions for the future could not have been more different. The U.S. championed democracy, capitalism, and open markets. The Soviet Union promoted communism, state control, and expansion of its ideology. The result was a world split in two, the capitalist West and the communist East. Containment and the early Cold War. The U.S. adopted a policy of containment, determined to stop the spread of communism. The Truman Doctrine pledged support to nations resisting communist pressure, while the Marshall Plan poured billions into rebuilding Western Europe, ensuring it would remain democratic and stable. In 1949, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb, shattering America's nuclear monopoly. That same year, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was formed, uniting Western nations in defense. The Red Scare at home. Fear of communism gripped America. Senator Joseph McCarthy claimed to uncover communist spies in government, Hollywood, and even the military. Accusations, blacklists, and ruined careers marked the McCarthy era, a time of paranoia and suspicion. Korea and Vietnam. The Cold War soon turned hot in places far from Washington and Moscow. In Korea, 1950 to 1953, the U.S. and United Nations forces fought to repel communist North Korean troops, backed by China. The war ended in stalemate, with the peninsula divided at the 38th parallel. In Vietnam, what began as support for a French colony turned into a decades-long conflict. By the 1960s, hundreds of thousands of American troops were fighting in Southeast Asia. The war dragged on with mounting casualties, sparking fierce protests at home, until U.S. forces withdrew in 1973. The space race and the nuclear standoff. The Cold War wasn't only about soldiers and weapons. It was also about prestige, science, and the skies above. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, stunning the world. America responded with massive investments in science and technology, leading to NASA's creation. The race culminated in 1969, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin of Apollo 11 set foot on the Moon, a triumph broadcast to millions around the world. Meanwhile, the threat of nuclear war hung over daily life. Schools held duck and cover drills. Families built bomb shelters. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world closer to nuclear war than ever before, as American and Soviet ships faced off until a tense agreement was reached. Civil rights and social change. While America fought communism abroad, struggles for freedom unfolded at home. The civil rights movement, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X, challenged segregation and racial injustice. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 became landmark victories, though the fight for equality continued. The 1960s and 70s also saw new movements. The women's liberation movement, pushing for equality in work and education. The environmental movement, sparked by works like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Protests against the Vietnam War, which united students, activists, and veterans in calls for peace. Toward the end of the Cold War. By the 1980s, the U.S. under President Ronald Reagan took a hard stance against the Soviet Union, calling it the evil empire. Yet behind the rhetoric, change was brewing. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduced reforms, glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, to save his struggling nation. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, long a symbol of division, fell. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. The Cold War had ended. America triumphant, yet challenged. The United States emerged as the world's lone superpower. But the decades of the Cold War had reshaped the nation, leaving legacies of civil rights, technological marvels, cultural upheavals, and a new role as the guardian of global democracy. Yet as the 20th century neared its close, new challenges, economic, political, and global, were waiting on the horizon. Part 20: America in the Modern Age, Challenges and Hope in a New Century. The Cold War had ended. The Soviet Union had fallen. And the United States stood alone as the world's most powerful nation. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, Americans entered a new era, one full of hope, but also full of challenges that would shape the future in profound ways. The 1990s, a decade of change. The 1990s were years of optimism. Technology surged forward, with the rise of the Internet, personal computers, and cell phones, forever transforming communication and daily life. The U.S. economy grew, and globalization connected markets like never before. American culture, music, movies, sports, spread worldwide. Yet challenges remained. The Gulf War of 1991 saw the U.S. lead a coalition to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait. At home, political battles raged over healthcare, taxes, and social policies. Tragedy struck in 1995 with the Oklahoma City bombing, a stark reminder that threats to peace could come from within. September 11, 2001. Then, on a clear September morning, everything changed. On September 11, 2001, terrorists hijacked 4 planes, crashing 2 into the World Trade Center in New York City, 1 into the Pentagon, and 1 into a Pennsylvania field after passengers fought back. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost. The attacks shocked the world and united Americans in grief and resolve. President George W. Bush declared a war on terror, leading to wars in Afghanistan and later Iraq. The fight against terrorism would define U.S. foreign policy for decades to come. Technology and transformation. As the 2000s and 2010s unfolded, technology reshaped society at lightning speed. Social media platforms connected people globally, giving ordinary citizens a voice but also spreading misinformation and division. Smartphones put the world in every pocket, changing how Americans worked, learned, and lived. Struggles for equality continue. The fight for equality pressed on. The early 21st century saw the election of Barack Obama in 2008, the nation's first African-American president, a milestone of progress, though racial and political tensions persisted. Movements like Black Lives Matter called for justice against systemic racism and police brutality. The LGBTQ+ rights movement achieved major victories, culminating in the Supreme Court's 2015 ruling that legalized same-sex marriage nationwide. Women continued to push for equal pay and representation, carrying forward the legacy of generations before them. Economic challenges and crises. The Great Recession of 2008 shook the nation, as banks collapsed and unemployment soared. Recovery came slowly, testing the resilience of American families. Later, the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 brought unprecedented challenges, halting daily life, straining healthcare systems, and reshaping work, education, and society itself. America's place in the world. Even as challenges mounted, the United States remained deeply engaged in global affairs, leading alliances, providing humanitarian aid, and often finding itself both admired and criticized as the most powerful nation on earth. Looking ahead. The history of the United States is one of contradictions, of great triumphs and deep struggles, of liberty and inequality, of progress and setbacks. It is a story still unfolding, carried forward by each new generation. From the first peoples who walked the continent, to the colonists who dared to dream of independence, to the immigrants who crossed oceans, to the citizens who fight for justice today, America has always been more than a nation. It has been an idea, an ongoing experiment in freedom, democracy, and human possibility. And though the challenges of the modern age are many, the promise of America endures, that through resilience, courage, and hope, its people can continue to shape a better future. Phew. That was a lot, as America's history is lengthy, descriptive, and controversial. Next, let's take a look at a variety of fun facts regarding the history of the United States to finish off this episode. Continue to close your eyes and drift to sleep.